Mana System, Hello, World. By M.J. Markgrove. Chapter 211, Flames of Rebellion. Emma slipped through the grimy back alleys of the port town in the guise of a malnourished adolescent male. It was hard taking a form so small, but she found over her years that slaves tended to only trust those worse off than them. Her destination was a storage warehouse and sleeping quarters for dock slaves. She wasn't going to bother with the ship slaves, since most of those were hardened criminals. She still couldn't believe how idiotic those freed slaves on the island had been. There was no way they didn't know what they unleashed. But years of pent-up anger and frustration had clouded their common sense. Slavery as a concept didn't bother her all that much. It was a universal constant, with some form of slavery existing in almost every world within the system. Boss was an idealist, even if he didn't realize it. This plan of his would likely backfire on all of them, but she was carrying it out anyway. Normally she would have just slipped away at the next port and disappeared, but the boss didn't know that he had saved her life by recruiting her. She had been tracking a group of Protectorate assassins looking for her on Gorsh. They had even given her the correct passphrase, but she wasn't an idiot. She had long since stopped using passphrases as a means of determining friend or foe. It was much easier to rely on rumors. That's how she knew the captain was with Barkos and Kickle, and that he was likely trustworthy. She despised owing anyone, especially for saving her life. Testing him as she did was probably foolish, but she had to make sure. And if they hadn't come when they did, she would have died within the hour. While she had some skill at subterfuge and hiding, she couldn't hide forever against a trained assassin. And the group looking for her was right behind the captain and his group, literally. She spotted them lurking in a nearby alley during the reunion. But they knew better than to mess with the Blade Master, Barkos. I mean, he trained them after all. So that was why she stayed with the crew, to avoid death at the hands of the Protectorate. And she carried out this harebrained scheme of the captain's to get an ounce of revenge against her former employer. She would give it her all to pay off this debt if it took the rest of her life, but she certainly wouldn't tell the captain about it. The man was borderline suicidal, and while she was fine paying off this debt, she wasn't going to risk her life for someone else. Besides, if the man got himself killed, her debt was cleared. She slipped inside the warehouse and faked falling down and dropping one of the enchanted items the captain gave her. It flew from her hand and she scrambled to pick it up, only to have a burly man place his foot over it. Inwardly she smiled. Well, what do we have here? A starving street urchin here to steal what little us slaves get? And what's this? He asked, slipping his foot away from her grasping arm and picking up the item. Gimme, I need that to free my father. The large man looked perplexed, as he stared at the unassuming piece of leather. And how, pray tell, are you going to free your father with this? Emma clamped her mouth shut and tried to scoot into a sitting position when two more slaves grabbed her. Answer him, boy, one of the gruff men behind her said, his breath reeking of cheap booze. Playing the terrified child act, she answered. T was told it could get his collar off. Only need to rub it along the side. Murmurs broke out amongst the slaves and Emma suppressed a smile. Her plan was coming together perfectly. All except for the next part. A few of the slaves took exception to her lies and beat her, not that they hurt her all that much, but it still sucked. He's a goddamn liar is what he is, one of the men spit, and Emma felt the disgusting projectile land on her back. The captain was going to owe her big for this. What if he ain't? Another slave asked. Only one way to find out, the man with the leather item replied. Nobody tried to stop him as he rubbed it across the collar. There was a loud click as the collar broke into its default halves and clattered against the floor amongst shocked silence. There was a stampede of feet and a chorus of voices clamoring for the leather strip, Emma all but forgotten as the slaves fought to be the next to be free. Emma used the uproar to change into an unassuming man and slip out through the same door she entered. She had a few more locations to visit before returning to the ship. The ship was prepped and ready to leave at a moment's notice. While it wasn't visible, you could sense something had changed within the town. The guards were more hurried, yet trying not to seem like they were, and the citizens could be seen in clusters talking amongst themselves in low whispers and glancing around nervously. People were aware something was going on, but not what just yet. It wouldn't take long. The bells that were normally reserved for signaling pirate attacks started clanging throughout the city. Well, that didn't take long, Barkos snorted, pointing into the distance where a waft of smoke could be seen coming from the warehouse district. It wasn't long before flames joined the smoke as the flames leaped into the air. Minutes later an angry mob of mostly men stormed the dock near where the fire erupted and a violent riot broke out. The men carried makeshift clubs or spears as they clashed with a group of guards and a few unfortunate crew from ships near that dock. The guards were holding the mass of angry men back, but there were more than they could handle. Perhaps they will take my warning seriously now. If they can't handle a few angry dock workers, how can they expect to handle a fleet of hardened pirates, hell-bent on revenge and murder? Barcos just shrugged. If I were still with the Legion, I might condemn your actions, but it seems my fair country has fallen quite far in my absence. Perhaps you are correct, they need a wake-up call. I didn't think Barcos cared one way or the other. At least his actions to date haven't indicated as much. I think it's time to go, Captain, Barcos nudged me, pointing toward a figure running down the dock. It was Emma, but she wasn't alone, being chased by another group of free slaves going by their ratty clothing and improvised weapons. All right. Kickle, get us moving, Emma will have to catch up as we are on the move, I spoke into the radio. Already on it, Captain. The ship rose in its cradle and started moving slowly back. I saw Emma mouth what was probably a curse as she put on more speed, her arms growing those flaps so she could fly across the distance when she arrived. The men chasing her were shouting and trying to throw rocks at her, but she did her eye trick and swerved to avoid the projectiles as they sailed at her. With a powerful leap at the end of the dock, thanks to her transforming her legs into jerboa legs, she sailed high above and flapped her arms to propel herself to the retribution, where she landed with a light thud. What the fuck? Couldn't you have waited at the dock for me? I shook my head. If we did, we would have had to deal with those angry men chasing you. Then we would have had to stay and explain why they were chasing you. Better we get out before this entire town turns into a madhouse. I could already see other ships with the same idea. Crews were running for their ships, and ships that recently docked were already leaving port. Some of the crews weren't as lucky, as groups of angry former slaves cut them off from their ships and beat them. Well, fuck, Emma replied as she gazed at her handiwork. By the way, you owe me a nice dinner after this. Hey, what? I don't have those kinds of feelings for you, I stammered out, not wanting to lead the woman on. PFF, in your dreams. I meant I want a nice dinner with someone I choose, you daft ninny. Oh, thank God, I replied without thinking. What, you think, you're too good for me, she glared back. Knowing any answer I gave would be the wrong one, I simply turned and headed below deck to strap myself in. I could hear her angrily muttering as she followed far behind me, all the while Barcos chuckled. By the time we made our next stop, news of the slave uprising had already spread. There was a tense fear in the air, and slaves were being watched with a very critical eye by heavily armed guards. Still, I sent Emma in, this time to hide the tags with a note attached to them. By the time they were discovered, we would be gone, hopefully. We did this 3 more times, finding one island that had executed all of the slaves to prevent any issues. I had to ruthlessly squash my anger and desire to rain death and destruction on this island. I knew my actions would have dire consequences, but the slaves couldn't even fight back, they could only stand there while a bored soldier slit their throats as if he was at a butcher's yard. We stuck around at this island until past nightfall. When it was dark enough, I followed the guard responsible for the killing. What he got next was well-deserved retribution for his inhumane actions. I couldn't stop islands from executing slaves, but I could send a message that their deaths would be avenged. I may have gone a bit psychotic in doling out justice. Using my prodigious strength, I ripped the man's ribcage open while he was under the effect of silence. He was alive when I did that. Not my proudest moment, but it finally wiped the bored look off his face, so it was worth it. I did end his suffering shortly after, but I strung the body up and left it hanging from a street light. I didn't think anyone would miss the symbolism of a dead guard wearing a slave collar and swinging from a lamp, but I never underestimated the power of stupidity. I also left it in a very visible spot so the guards couldn't simply cut it down and hide it away before people saw it. As I was returning to the ship, I ran into Barcos. Was that necessary? He frowned at me. It was the first time I had seen the man genuinely upset by something. And considering he was trapped on a hellhole for 10 years, it was surprising. I may have snapped a bit, I replied, owning up to my mistake. He nodded and fell into step beside me. We all have our demons, Captain. But you need to control yours because you are responsible for the lives of others. What would have happened if you were caught? I hadn't thought about it at the time, I only wanted revenge. But he was right. If I was caught killing a guard, I would likely have died as other guards swarmed the area. Then the ship's failsafe would activate and boom, no more ship, hell, probably no more town, considering the amount of mana stored in the ship. Even if I did survive, the ship would be seized and my crew would be arrested. I needed to be better and let my anger go, but seeing people treated like disposable cattle brought all the rage flooding back that I had felt when I was a slave myself. Nothing good, I replied quietly. Barkos snorted, a gross understatement, but I will let your actions slide. So long as you know they were wrong. There is no point drudging up the mistakes of the past. I gave the man a curious look. What? I can be serious and understanding, I just choose not to be, I had enough of that in the Legion. Chapter 212, Victory of Ash. Turns out I probably didn't need to make a statement by killing the guard. I forgot one thing. It was small but very important. A lot of slaves still had families. The next morning the town literally exploded in violence as the surviving families of slaves dragged the government officials out and beat them into submission. Yet, turns out offing simple debtors that were paying off their debt by working as a slave was not a smart thing to do. And after mourning their dead loved ones, the families took action. There were far more affected civilians than there were guards or officials. After the mob assembled, they dragged the unconscious public officials onto the same stage the slaves were executed on and returned the favor. Seeing which way the wind was blowing, every ship had quickly left port. I didn't know what the Protectorate's response to this rebellion would be, but I knew it wouldn't be pretty. Then again, maybe these people would fight back. Judging by the growing fires we saw as we sailed off, I expected the town was in civil war. There might not be anything left by the time the Legion arrived to deal with this one island, and we had already heard that the fighting had spread to 2 islands we hadn't even visited. Likely thanks to the enchanted items I had hide. It was strange being on the periphery of such chaos that you had personally helped foster. I didn't feel shame for my actions, well, except for the guard. But he would have died the next morning anyway. I did feel a little bad for dragging a bunch of innocent people into the mess I created. But only slightly. If they didn't turn to slavery, none of this would have happened. I did wonder if my actions would get back to the guild. Considering how much they knew about me, it was a high likelihood. While Director Tolish seemed like a nice enough fellow and I hadn't targeted any guild ships, it remained to be seen if he wanted to work with me after he learned of my actions. I figured he still would, simply for the fact that he worked with any guild-affiliated power, even though one of those was the Silien. An empire directly built around slavery. I suspected the Silien was where the Black Dragon got the idea to start their slave empire from, but I couldn't be certain. It didn't matter. We sailed away from the island, while I decided our next course of action. I quickly decided that I had riled up the population enough with our antics. Even without our direct intervention, I suspected the slave revolt would continue to grow. It was time to go back to why I was still in this area, and that was to hunt down a pirate that wronged me. Chani the executioner lay on the floor of the ship in a pool of his own blood. His former second of command, bloody and heaving only a few steps away. Lycan had been a pirate for over a decade before he was captured and pressed into slavery. And he knew when a captain was more trouble than they were worth. Chani was one of those types of captains. Fixated on causing the most amount of bloodshed and damage without thinking of the issues that it caused or the response it would bring down on top of them. Overly aggressive pirate captains tended to disappear rather quickly in the Isles. Either they bit off more than they could chew and got caught or killed, or the pirate kings came to deal with them. There wasn't anything that got those pricks moving faster than disrupting their bottom line. The former third mate stepped into the room, took one look at the corpse of the former captain, then looked at Lycan. Lycan could see the thoughts working their way through the man's eyes. He was injured, perhaps I could take him and become captain myself? Lycan firmed his grip on the sword he held, ready to burst into action if the other man made a move. But he didn't. Captain, we have a fleet of 4 ships closing in on us from the west. What are your orders? Lycan was momentarily surprised by the man not attacking him, but he suspected the man was pragmatic enough not to start a fight for captaincy while there were possible hostile ships heading their way. Do we have anyone who can identify the ships? Not so far, but they aren't waving any banners and they are larger than a galleon. Lycan cursed. Had he acted sooner, perhaps he could have avoided raising the ire of the pirate kings, but it was too late now. Now he could only try and escape from their fleet. Turn us about and let's try to lose them. If we need to sacrifice a ship or 2 to make it happen, do it. Fire on them if they refuse my order. Shortly after, the ship lurched sideways as men yelled orders from above. Lycan quickly washed the blood from his face and ordered one of the gun crews to clean up the mess in the cabin and throw the body overboard. The crew needed to know he was in charge, so he headed to the command platform and stood in stoic silence while the crew rushed about to get them moving away from the approaching enemy. Lycan wasn't a coward, but he knew when to cut and run. "Captain, we have 9 unknown vessels on the horizon." "Oh," I replied as Kickle pointed out the tiny dots on the screen. I still didn't understand how he could pick those up from so far out. "Well, let's go see who it is. Emma, could you go see if Barcos is up and ready? We may have some action soon." The woman slid out of her chair and skipped out of the room. I wonder what had her in such a good mood. "They're definitely pirates, Captain," Kickle replied, looking a bit distressed. "The group at the front is the ship that the slaves sent off, I'm almost sure of it. But the 4 at the back are what's making me want to turn around and leave." I looked at the jerboa in surprise. "What? Why? Those are part of Blackgar's fleet. My guess is they are led by the enforcer himself." I remembered who Blackgar was. There wasn't a port around that didn't have his picture up. He was one of the pirate kings and the enforcer was one of his sub-captains. A ruthless lianoid by the name of Sarvis. I had studied up on most of the really dangerous pirates in the region. Calling a lianoid a beastman would likely get you ripped apart. Even if it was technically true. They had short tempers and prodigious strength. Like humans, lianoids were the sole intelligent species in their world before the system came along. They quickly found their niche as mercenaries and soldiers. But their beast heritage was mostly gone, leaving only telltale signs like the faded striping or wild mane of hair. What are our chances? In a direct confrontation, not good. Those 4 ships aren't simply retrofitted merchants' vessels, they are full-on warships. If we surprise them, we may get 1 or 2, but I doubt we could take on all 4. This is the man the pirate Blackgar sends out when he wants assurances that the job will be done. Why do you think they are out here anyway? My guess, probably to deal with those freed pirate slaves. Attacking their enterprises was not a wise choice by whoever is in charge. It was bound to get noticed by the bigwigs eventually. I tapped my fingers on the arm of my table and thought as I decided on a course of action. Foolish it may be, but it was better to find out now if my ship could handle the abuse. Get us on an intercept course for those 5 lead ships. If there is an opening, I want to exploit it. I figured this was the best of both worlds. Eliminating a problem I helped spawn while giving the more dangerous faux pas to think about the new player. Or I could be wrong and we are all going to die. A few minutes later, Barcos and Emma walked into the room. "What do we got, Captain?" Barcos asked, trying to suppress a yawn and failing miserably. How a man could sleep as much as him, I didn't know. Even with being drunk, his endurance should make it so he recovered in a few hours, but the man slept like 10 hours a day. "We stumbled across those pirate slaves that are making a mess out here. Oh, also, seems like they are being pursued by Sarvis." That perked the man right up. "Oh, does that mean we are going to get to fight with the enforcer?" I didn't like the maniacal gleam in Barcos's eye. "What? No, we are going to take out the 5 former pirate slaves, then leave. Or that's the plan at least." Barcos laughed. "Well, we will see once we get there. I somehow doubt the enforcer will be happy with our meddling." To be fair, I was curious to see how we would measure up. I know Kickle didn't give us good odds, but the man was a bit of a fatalist. Whereas I was a bit more like Barcos, looking for the thrill of battle, although, I tempered my lust with a bit more pragmatism. While it would be fun to go toe-to-toe with the big shot, I had a specific goal here. Plans could change though, and going by the slowly closing fleets, we may not even be needed. It took around an hour to close the distance to the ships, and already the 2 fleets had exchanged a handful of attacks. I would have thought the former pirate slaves would be heavily outmatched, but that didn't appear to be the case. In a strange move, one of the fleeing ships broke off and started fleeing in a different direction. None of the pursuing ships gave chase though. "Kickle, let's go after that lone ship." "You read my mind, Captain." Invisibly, the Retribution dove toward the ocean surface, picking up speed as we zipped underneath the oblivious ships. Well, not completely unseen. It wasn't until we went in pursuit of the other ship that one of the pursuing ships of the Enforcer's fleet broke off to give chase. I didn't believe in coincidence. "Looks like we were spotted, Captain," Kickle lamented while Barcos rubbed his hands in giddy anticipation for the fight to come. "Kickle, I think, I'm going to be needed on deck." "Don't use the special weapon unless you have to. We should be able to take on 2 ships." Kickle grumbled quietly but nodded his head. "All right, let's get ready to greet our guests." Chapter 213, Pirate Tide. The first shots came from our pursuer, ranging shots to increase accuracy. It wouldn't have been an issue except one of the shots managed to land, disrupting our cloak and ruining our approach. The damage was minimal since it was an inert round, but still, the shield flickered to life shortly after, Kickle doing his best to run all of the systems at once. It didn't take long for our quarry to notice us after that, and now we were stuck between two ships firing on us. Kickle did his best to avoid the shots and return fire. It wouldn't have been possible at all without the ship having so many features, like the targeting reticle. I covered my eyes as the topside cannon sent out blinding beams of mana at our target. Unlike a laser, these beams of destructive energy were easy to see with the naked eye. The enemy shield wavered from the impact. They must have realized escape wasn't an option anymore and turned to fire a broadside at us. Moments before I saw the flash of cannon fire, the retribution lurched out from under me, and it was only thanks to Barco's grabbing onto me that I was still on the ship. "You said it was safe to wait on the deck," I yelled. "No," I said, "it should be fine." "I'm fine, so is Emma," he smiled, pointing to an unfazed Emma. "Well, what the hell, how do you keep from flying free? Years of being aboard fighting vessels," he smirked, "or a skill to keep you rooted in place." Damn it, I realized I should have kept that solid footing skill now. But how was I to know that was what it was for? In hindsight it made sense. All of the other ships I fought had open-top decks with railing on the side, but they could dive just as easily as our ship, and people had to adapt to changing circumstances. But I had never designed the retribution to accommodate fighting on deck. It was flat on top because flat was easy to do. I pulled out my control tablet and engaged one of the more esoteric defensive features at minimum power. I felt the magnetic force suck my feet to the deck as Barco's TSKED in annoyance. "That'll make fighting a bit harder, but I guess I could use the resistance training." I just shrugged and Emma seemed unconcerned. It wasn't surprising since she didn't use metal of any sort. Her clothes and weapons were a part of her. Speaking of weapons, I tested both my staves. Consuming Void was slightly affected, but nothing I couldn't power through if I had to. But Dominion and Destruction was unaffected. Probably because the ends were made from a mithril alloy that wasn't magnetic. My armor was similarly unaffected, being made from hydrascale and mithril. The only reason my boots were magnetic was that they were just standard steel-toed boots. I had no more time for testing as men started jumping from the ship in front of us and flying over. I really wished we could go on the offensive at times like this, but it just wasn't possible with the small crew size. A shadowy form materialized behind me, or tried to. I heard the scream as the teleportation scrambler did its job and the man fell below the ship. The pirates were quick to change tactics though, as they popped in above the field and dropped through the force field using that crystal dust or specialized poles tipped with mana crystals. It seemed the poles were single use as their tiny crystals popped as they tried to absorb the massive amount of energy flowing through the shield. So not as effective as the dust. While most made it through, some weren't so lucky and their bodies sizzled and popped as they impacted the defensive barrier. I didn't spare any more time for those unfortunate fools as I was already in motion, slapping aside an axe with the end of my staff. I used the magnetic defenses to my advantage, slapping the weapon low. It wasn't enough to get it stuck to the deck, but the added resistance slowed my target down just enough for me to use my metallic hand as a spear through his heart. The man had a look of shocked surprise. I grabbed the man's ribcage and hurled him into a group of 3 more attackers, knocking them all down. Emma zipped past me and stabbed the 3 downed men with her bone blades. "Now this is a fight." I heard Barco's laugh. I spared a moment to look and saw him engaged with 6 saber-wielding pirates, the motions a blur so quick, even I couldn't see what was going on. I felt a blade slam into my back before I saw the offender. It was that damn shadow teleport fuck. My armor had saved me from a possibly deadly blow as the man didn't have the strength to push through its defensive properties. I spun around, quick swapping my staff for Consuming Void as the man tried to turn to smoke and teleport away anywhere. My staff flashed through his fading form, eliciting a scream of pain as the spiritual damage did its thing. The man vanished a moment later, but I doubt he would return. With the combined effects of the teleportation scrambler and having taken spiritual damage, if he woke up before he slammed into the ocean surface, I would be surprised. I spun around again, using my staff to block a sword swing, but only for a moment as my weapon vanished into my ring. The pirate, expecting resistance, was thrown off balance by the sudden lack thereof. I let the weak blow skitter across my armor as I punched forward, activating reverberating strike and double strike. The first blow was followed by an audible crack as my metal fist hammered into the side of his ribs. I quickly cast Shockwave and hammered a second strike home, sending the man cartwheeling across the deck. More enemies were landing on deck, so I needed to pick up the pace. Dominion and Destruction appeared in my hand again, and I smashed the end of it into a pirate's throat, taking the enemy's mace to the side of my head. I staggered sideways at the blow and used Rejuvenate on the minor damage. Mostly to my pride, but I was seeing double for a few seconds. I recovered just in time to see a sword lancing for my neck. I knew I wouldn't be able to snap my staff up quick enough to deflect the attack, so I activated Time Shutter, rolling back a second and giving me the time I needed to block the attack. I'm sure to the pirate, it seemed like my weapon teleported into place. I used my free hand to blast him in the stomach with Energy Lance, which may have been a mistake from so close. The force of the blast blew us apart and I crashed into the door to the ship. My opponent wasn't as lucky, as he went sailing off the Retribution. I wouldn't say these pirates were all that good, but they fought with a ferocity beyond anything I had seen, besides myself. I managed to get to my feet and survey the battle. Barcos had dispatched 3 of his 6 attackers and had a line of other dead behind him. Apparently, others thought to get in on the action. It took me time to spot Emma, and I watched her cleave a pirate's head clean off with a sharpened elongated arm bone before she vanished amongst the chaos to appear somewhere else, stabbing another pirate through the back. I was glad she was on our side. I rushed back into the fight, this time leading with charge and unstoppable force. Thinking to stop me, one pirate leaned into his shield to absorb the impact. He sadly misjudged the force of my impact. His steel shield caved in under the force of my fist as I heard his arm snap. It did save his life though, as my fist was deflected slightly, only grazing his scalp. A flap of skin and hair was torn free as the man screamed and was shoved to the side. I went to stomp on his face but forgot about the force of the magnetism on my shoes. By the time I got my foot up, the ship lurched from under me again and I was momentarily airborne. A series of explosions rippled across the force field, showing that Kickle's maneuver wasn't entirely successful. What worried me was the last impact and not seeing a follow-up ripple from the shield. I crashed back aboard the deck along with any pirates that managed to not get tossed off by the motion. My downed opponent was gone, however. I scrambled to my feet and turned in the direction that the last attack had come from. The pursuit ship had caught up. I felt something ominous and dove to the deck. A crimson wave blasted through where I had just been standing, slicing 3 pirates apart. I turned and spotted the source. A bulky lianoid with black and white striped hair was grinning wildly at me. I had heard of your crew's reputation, I'm glad it wasn't all fluff and lies. Come, little pirate hunter, let's see how good you really are. I used Identify and groaned, of course, it had to be him. Sarvis Sankeen /Tactician 25/15. I knew this was going to be a hard fight as I got into my battle stance and relaxed the grip on my staff. I need to be fluid with my weapon, something I had learned from fighting Barcos. I was just about to rush in when Barcos stepped in front of me. You are hardly a challenge for our illustrious captain, so I will be more than enough to deal with the likes of you, he smirked at Sarvis. When I looked to where Barcos had been fighting, all I saw were dead bodies. Had he been toying with them this entire time? What am I thinking? Of course, he toyed with him, the lazy shit. And now that there was an actual challenge, he wanted it for himself. Well, you know what, he can have it. Have fun, I said as I turned to the new pirates that were appearing on the deck. What had started with a 2-way brawl had turned into a free-for-all. I had Emma to partially thank for this. She had the former slave pirates so disoriented they were attacking anyone and everyone that got close to them. I rushed in, dodging another one of those crimson slashes from Sarvis. He had no more time to try and fight me as he was fully engaged with Barcos. If I had thought Barcos was fast before, holy shit was he fast now. As the two engaged, their arms were a blur so quick I only heard the ringing impacts from the weapons. I crashed into the closest pirate, using the leverage of my swing to spin me out of the way of a spear thrust aimed at my face. I jammed my open palm out at the spearman and released Frost Wave. My attack caught 5 others, but without overcharging it, it wasn't nearly as effective. I was about to cast Maddening Laugh when silence descended on me. Well, probably not me alone, but it did the trick, disrupting my spell. I looked around to try and find the source but was unable to locate it through the melee. That's fine, I didn't need sound to cast my next spell. I located a group of 3 locked into a duel and threw an Annihilator Sphere at them. I had to aim high to avoid tearing up the ship though. The first man's head exploded into dust moments before a fountain of blood escaped the now lifeless body. The other 2 escaped the brunt of the spell, but their weapons did not. That's when I spotted the mage. It was quite easy to locate him when he threw a crackling ball of greenish-blue energy at me. As with the enforcer's attack, I felt nothing good would come from letting this attack reach me. I used Time Shudder again to store my staff and pull out a standard mace I had as backup. I whipped the weapon at the oncoming ball of energy. When the two collided, the ball exploded into a torrent of electrified acid. I danced back to avoid the dangerous liquid as it spilled across the deck, eating into the armor and melting any pirate that was unlucky enough to get touched by the substance. After 10 seconds the liquid evaporated, leaving a large section of the deck pockmarked and bloody. Already the mage was preparing another spell. Violet bolts of lightning were forming between his hands and grew in intensity as his hands grew farther apart. I raised both my hands, firing energy lance from one and my monocannon from the other. The attacks exploded against a shimmering force field, but the man staggered back under the dual attacks. I snapped my hand closed to recharge and rushed the mage as my staff appeared, the ends crackling with imbued electricity and water. Two could play this game, asshole. Chapter 214, Survival. Kickle grumbled as the captain left him to fly the ship and man the weapons. It wasn't that he couldn't do it, but he knew it wouldn't be as effective. Especially with the captain telling him not to use the new weapon unless he absolutely had to. What good was having a weapon if you couldn't use it? To make matters worse, the ship trailing them was a warship from one of the pirate kings, which ship specifically, he didn't know. Kickle only knew the fleet belonged to the enforcer because of the flags they flew. He had avoided those bloody bastards like the plague when he hunted in these skies. The pirate kings weren't known to be forgiving to anyone that crossed them. And yet here they were about to go toe-to-toe with them. Muttering dark thoughts, Kickle jerked the ship down to avoid the oncoming fire from the ship ahead of them. It probably wasn't necessary, but he got no small amount of joy when he saw the captain lose his footing and sail into the air, only to be saved by Barcos. Said man glared in annoyance through the ship directly at Kickle when the captain turned his head. Kickle chuffed in amusement, 2 for 1. Annoying Barcos was always a plus in his eyes. The moment of fun aside, Kickle accelerated toward the turning vessel and fired. The enemy ship was rocked as all of the shots impacted their shield. The enemy shield remained up, but now they had the enemy's attention as a flurry of fighters flew from their deck to try and board the Retribution. Kickle did his best to blast them from the air, but he wasn't as fast as the captain was with the weapons targeting. He couldn't wholly concentrate on the ship in front of them either. The trailing vessel would be within weapons range in less than a minute. Already Kickle could see fighters preparing on their deck, some on the guns, others ready to cross the distance and do battle aboard our ship. Kickle needed to convince the captain to take on more crew, especially if he wanted to fight in more encounters like this. They were highly outnumbered, and unlike that ambush they prepared, these men they fought had either nothing to lose or were hardened lifelong cutthroats, used to being top dogs. And not some two-bit hacks calling themselves pirates. Kickle all but ignored the battle on the deck as he weaved behind the turning vessel and blasted it from behind. This time the enemy ship's shield faltered and a quarter of his fire hit the enemy ship directly. But now came the dangerous part. He wanted to use their ship as a fire break against the other ship, but that meant placing the Retribution in clear broadside to the first ship. With their ship's higher maneuverability and speed, he felt it was worth the risk. To make it even better, he raked another volley along the side of the ship facing them. The enemy shields faltered again, not having recovered enough to protect against even one turret. Blasts of mana and scorching beams raked the enemy vessel. The enemy was prepared though, and most of the gun crews had retracted their cannons behind the armored panels. Most, but not all. Kickle managed to destroy 3 exposed cannons but missed another 4. Already the enemy was redeploying their guns, and Kickle started jerking the ship in an unpredictable pattern to try and throw them off. It helped a little, but really all it did was slow them down. The enemy fired and a quarter of their shots went wide, exploding away from the protective shield. The rest barely made the Retribution's impressive defensive shield flicker. The ship did rock against the incoming barrage, but it wasn't a concentrated fire, so the impact was negligible and spread over a longer time. That worked out in Kickle's favor as he fired back, this time specifically aiming for the enemy's cannons. He didn't want to crash their ship, just take it out of the fighting. Going by the explosions on the other side of the vessel, that probably wouldn't last long. The third ship had arrived and they were pounding the piss out of the ship between them. And there was nothing the ship could do about it. Both the Retribution and the other ship were faster and better armed. Without warning, the enemy ship dropped. Kickle cursed and violently wrenched the Retribution down as well, but it was too late to avoid the barrage of incoming fire from the now exposed warship and the former slave pirate ship. A cunning move by the enemy captain. The Retribution rocked violently and the shield collapsed under the enormous strain. Kickle fired back at the middle ship but noticed a glaring red warning on the viewer that said shield emitter malfunction. The warship seemed content to blast away at the other ship until it truly fell from the sky this time. Then it turned its attention toward the retribution. Kickle turned face on toward the enemy ship as enemy fighters and incoming rounds impacted the weapons aboard the retribution. He needed to get closer to activate the captain's new weapon. He hoped the boss and those above could handle fighting off two crews. Barco's matched dagger with scimitar as he clashed with the famous pirate enforcer. The man was skilled and it only made Barcos smile all the more. The two clashed again and Barcos used the opportunity to stealthily throw two daggers at the man. The pirate knocked one aside with his wide blade and the other with a small buckler. Barcos danced aside as a wave of red energy tore a vertical slash through the deck. Barcos hadn't had an interesting fight like this in 11 years. Not since he took down the Darmus twins that plagued the eastern side of the Protectorate. Now there were some skilled fighters and beautiful to boot. Too bad he had to kill them. He still remembered their lithe movements, born of a dancer's background. The two had run him around in circles for a full 10 minutes before he managed to injure one of the sisters with one of his daggers. After that it was not much of a challenge, the other sister flew into a rage and abandoned all reason to try and end his life. But Barcos persevered. Although, persevered is probably a generous description. Killing those two women led him down a dark path to try and recover from what he felt at the time was lost honor, leading him to be termed a mad dog and ending with his exile. He supposed he owed those two women thanks because if it wasn't for their sacrifice, he wouldn't have learned to let go, instead of chasing victory and glory just for the sake of it. A blinding flash of light came from the pirate's shield and Barcos flinched back. Already he could hear the Lionoid roaring in victory as he charged his blinded opponent. Barcos sighed internally. So not the fight he hoped. Feeling the large man's oncoming steps in the vibrations of the deck plating, Barcos waited until the last moment and teleported behind his target. The pirate was in full swing and couldn't pull back while Barcos's blade slashed across his side, only catching a small bit of flesh as the overgrown cat rolled into his swing and away from the surprise attack. Okay, so maybe this fight wasn't a waste. Blinking away the lingering spots, Barcos smiled as he saw his opponent checking his wound with his offhand. The hand came back bloody but the Lionoid snarled and grinned at Barcos. The two clashed again as they moved across the deck, killing anyone dumb enough to get in their way. Emma stabbed her unwary opponent in the back and threw a kidney with her bone blade. The man arched his back and tried to frantically slash at her with his blade but she twisted it sideways, causing the man to drop his weapon, then she wrenched her blade out the side of his torso, throwing the man to the ground and vanishing into the melee for another target. She didn't miss ship-to-ship fighting, it was too chaotic, too unpredictable for her. Give her a designated target for assassination and she would be able to carry that out without issue, but here, most of her skills were rendered useless. Eventually, someone always figured out how to counter her, just don't let anyone get within striking range of them. Already half the first ship's survivors were doing just this. Although with the third party joining the battle, it actually made them easier to single out and kill. She didn't need to be the one that killed them, just the one that made it possible for them to be killed. She moved like an unseen wraith, putting her obfuscation skills to great use as she slipped unseen into the new enemy forces. She saw the mage targeting the captain but she was on the wrong side of the fight to do anything about it. She figured he could deal with one mage. As for Barcos, he and the enforcer were tearing up the deck as they raced about trying to take advantage of one another. She made a mental note to keep an eye on their fight and stay far away from where they may appear. She bumped into one of her companions eliciting a scathing response, "Watch it, you Edie." It took the new pirate a moment to realize he was speaking to his doppelganger, not that it mattered. Emma slipped her bone blade through the side of his neck and throat. The man fell to the deck and bled out before he could fumble a health potion from his ring. Emma grabbed the potion and sucked it down, storing it in an internal pouch within her body for emergency use. She looked around but nobody had noticed the pirate die so she moved position and went to find another target. The mage cast a spell and tried to fly free of the deck as I approached, but I slammed my staff down on his shield, which seemed to be connected to him. The blow caused the man to crash back to the deck and stumble. This is why connected shields were not all that great. The same thing happened to ships, they shook when the shield took blows. The mage glared at me before whipping his hand in my direction. A bolt of lightning flew from his fingertips. I turned sideways, letting the bolt impact the shoulder with my good hand. I barely felt the pain thanks to my armor and elemental resistances. I didn't have any way to stop him from casting inside his shield so I knew this was going to turn into a slugfest, his shield versus my strength. He readied yet another spell as I cast Time Shudder, then I activated Area of Denial and cast Flurry of Blows since I was outside the area of his silence spell. My strikes impacted the mage's shield in rapid staccato, causing the man to flinch and fail his newest attack. As each strike hammered home, the man stumbled and I could see sweat beading on his forehead. As my last strike impacted his shield, the man reeled but he was still protected. Not for long though. I multicast an overcharged flurry before the man recovered and each strike rang like a bell as his shield buckled and warped under the press of my assault. I paid no mind to the attacks bouncing off my own barrier. The only thing that could get through Area of Denial were people with tier 2 stats. And I would know by the shield cracking. Sort of like how this mage knew his end was close as his shield began to crack under my onslaught. On the second to last blow of my skill, his shield shattered and turned into motes of light. The mage collapsed to the ground, blood pouring from his nose. I strode over, well aware the man had burned all of his mana to keep his shield up to no avail. I whipped out a stunning gust behind me in a crescent slash, knocking the feeble attackers away from my back as the pirate mage looked at me with disdain. "The boss will kill you for this affront," the man spit, blood landing on my armor and dripping down. "Good, he can get in line." I wound up my staff and put my entire body into the blow. The man's head deformed like a rotten melon as his body flew across the deck. I flicked the brain matter from my staff and turned back to my other tormentors. I cracked my neck and grinned behind my mask as I stalked forward. I could practically feel the fear emanating from my opponents. Chapter 215, Joining Forces. I realized as I was about to rejoin the battle that something had changed. It took me a moment to figure out what it was. The pirates had stopped fighting amongst themselves and the survivors were all looking toward me and my crew. Even Barcos and Sarvis had broken off their conflict, neither man looking tired at all from the prolonged fight. But they weren't staring at us, they were staring past us. I risked a look over my shoulder and saw we were barreling toward Sarvis's ship. "Oh, fuck." My words seemed to be the match as the pirates boiled into a frenzy of motion. Some went for the hatch, others activated their flight skills, and the rest rushed us as if we had any control in this situation. I felt Barcos clap his hand on my shoulder before speaking. "Might wanna hold on, Captain, the next bit could be a little rough." I barely had time to nod before the null beam fired. The enemy ship's shield popped like an overinflated balloon only moments before the ravening blast of mana tore through its deck like tissue paper. What surprised me was the fact that the ship was still aloft and not crashing into the ocean below after the attack. Then I felt like my body weight increased several times over as the retribution soared skyward. I was confused by Kickle's maneuver for a moment before I felt my entire body tingle. I groaned in realization and had enough time to store my staff and drop to the deck, followed shortly by Barcos and a surprised Emma. The retribution practically skipped off the deck of the enemy ship with a grinding lurch skyward. Not all of that was due to the collision though. The full body tingle I felt was Kickle adjusting the levitation plates. Only he must have realized he turned them the wrong way before quickly correcting his mistake. Not that it would have saved us from hitting the ship, the system wasn't designed for rapid height changes without being close to another surface. I did feel when the runes kicked in though, and if we hadn't been laying on the deck, it would have likely broken bones. Even so, I grunted under the strain of the ship launching into the sky off of the other ship. If we survived through this madness, I was going to have a word with Kickle about this little maneuver. Using what little strength I could spare, I managed to look up and see the remaining pirates were far worse off than us. A few had been smart enough to hit the deck but most were collapsed and screaming, their shin bones being shoved through their legs and out through the sides, or worse, were flattened outright. Their low strength or endurance made it impossible for some to survive the high G maneuver. As soon as the weight lifted, the surviving pirates jumped to their feet to continue their assault. Oh, those foolish pirates, so eager to kill us they didn't yet realize what comes after an unaided rise. The ship experienced a moment of weightlessness before dropping from the sky like a brick. Startled by the ship falling while they were rushing toward us, the pirates lost contact with the deck and we whizzed past them before they could even activate their skills to try and fly back. At least that's what happened with the uninjured survivors. A few of the wounded managed to clear the back deck, but I heard more than a fair share of wet slaps as bodies and wounded impacted the raised section along the back of the ship and went sailing off the top or sides. I didn't spend long on thoughts of dead pirates as I hurried to pull my control tablet out while desperately clinging to the deck plate with my weakly magnetized boots. It didn't help that Barcos and Emma are clinging to me as well, and I can feel myself sliding back towards the hatch where there is no magnetization to keep me stuck to the deck. I managed to pin the tablet to the deck with one elbow and use my free hand to scroll through the controls to get to the correct setting. I realize at this moment, I should have designed a better interface. I cursed as I scrolled past the command I needed and quickly scrolled back, tapping the control to bring up the field strength. I use my finger to push the slider to maximum and feel every bit of metal on me get sucked tight to the deck. I groaned in pain again as I realized my mithril wasn't as non-magnetic as I thought, just weakly magnetic. But it was enough to force the breath from my lungs. I decided breathing was more important than a bit of extra magnetism, so I dialed down the force until I could breathe again. It seems it was just in time as the retribution was starting to level out, but we were far lower than our normal altitude. I dialed the field back some more as our ship fled from the combat zone. In the distance, I could make out the damaged but still flying enemy ship. There was no sign of the ship we were pursuing, but I was not overly surprised by that. What I was surprised by was all of the survivors heading to the damaged ship. I know for a fact some were from the other ship. "Captain, we got a problem," Emma pointed to the east. When I looked over, I was greeted by the sight of 4 ships trying to cut off our escape. Somehow the enemy managed to secure their prize or win over the former slave pirates. Well, some of them at least. "Get below deck, we need to make a run for it and I want off this insane roller coaster." Emma scurried to the hatch while Barkos stepped up beside me and looked at the ships coming for us. He let out a sigh. "A shame, I was having a good fight." I looked at him incredulously. "Why didn't you just kill him so we could clear the deck, then perhaps we could have taken down at least one of those warships?" Barkos had the audacity to shrug. The man was good. Better than I thought, but not quite good enough for me to commit to using any more skills on him. But if we ever tangle with one of the pirate kings, I'll be sure to give it my all. With that, he turned and headed below, leaving me to gape. I really wanted to punch that smug-ass smile off the man's face, but I needed to get much more skilled before that day would come. With 5 ships to our 1, the enemy had options. Likely they would try and box us in, but without an island to act as a wall, it wouldn't be nearly as effective. If they were faster, they could surround us, but even with the damage the ship endured during the fighting, we held the speed advantage. I took one last look at our new enemy and tromped below deck. Kickle was rattled by the impact against the other ship. He knew the captain was going to be pissed. Then there was the damage to the ship itself. Large portions of the display were blinking yellow or red. The parts of the display that were still working, that was. The impact broke a key component for the external view and half the outside view was just the interior wall. He was effectively blind on the right side of the ship until the captain fixed it. Kickle really hoped the captain could fix it. He had gotten used to having a full 360-degree view of everything. Emma was the first to stumble into the command room. He heard her hiss quietly as she took in the damage before she took her seat and strapped in before there were any more violent moves. Barkos came next and Kickle heard an aborted snort of amusement that the man tried to cover by coughing. Barkos came up and patted Kickle on the shoulder. "Not your best flying, but we're alive. Although, I should probably mourn for you now since the captain will probably kill you after seeing the damage you caused." The man laughed as he leaned away from Kickle's half-hearted punch before taking his seat as well. "You really think the captain will kill Kickle over this?" Emma asked in concern, which only made Barkos's snorting laugh even louder. "Probably not, although, this ship is like his baby, so who can say for certain?" "Kickle, do you prefer casket or cremation? Assuming the captain doesn't just toss you into the ocean." Kickle didn't rise to the provocation. He knew this was Barkos's way of getting back at him for that little joke earlier. It was probably a good thing he didn't, as the captain took that moment to walk in. "Oh, what the fucking hell?" I was too tired and sore to be pissed about the damage, although, I did glare at the back of Kickle's head for a good 30 seconds in complete silence. It felt good to make the man fidget nervously, but even that small enjoyment wasn't worth it as I realized I needed to get the ship to at least yellow status or we may actually fall out of the sky. I quickly checked on the monoreserves and while they were holding, they were barely holding, and that was without the shield being on or any other stealth system. I quickly ran through the damage list, each new system making my hopes fall just a bit more. Half of the turrets were scrapped from the fight and would have to have the entire dome replaced before they would be functional again. But they were still drawing power. It was a simple command to detach the damaged units as they were only connected to the ship by runic means. All but one successfully detached and plunged into the ocean below. That freed up a bit of energy, but it seemed like one of the main power conduits was leaking mana. I was glad that raw untamed mana wasn't inherently dangerous, at least in this quantity. It took something focusing the mana before it became deadly. "Keep us heading in this direction." I'll try to make some repairs, so try not to move too much or you'll scramble my brains while I'm in the maintenance corridor. I waited for Kickle to nod before I hurried out of the room to grab tools and spare parts. I was hoping fixing the power conduit would also fix the view screen. If not, we would be shit out of luck until we made it back to port, because I didn't see any damaged runes, which meant tearing out entire walls to find the damaged section behind them. I vented my frustration by grumbling about getting a better crew and having a larger ship for next time. Chapter 216, Overhaul. I had to remove my armor before I could shove myself into the tight crawl space behind the bulkhead and wall. Thankfully I fit. Otherwise, I would have to remove an entire wall section to get at the damaged areas. It wasn't the worst outcome, but it would take far longer to remove those than it would to simply slide behind it. I suppose if I was in dire straits, I could just rip the panel off with brute strength, but purposefully damaging my ship felt wrong. The power conduit wasn't like a normal electrical cable or even like the distribution lines I laid down on previous designs. Those worked to carry magical power in a similar way to my power conduit, but were thin and easily torn. So when I designed the retribution, I created the conduit as an upgrade. It was a series of finger-thick mithril bars that were square. The bars were mounted to rubber grommets that allowed them to flex and twist as needed. The runes carved into them did the rest. And they worked great, except with the flexibility came a lack of durability, although they were still stronger than a normal steel cable. They just weren't designed to have the sharp edge of a compressed titanium plate shoved through them. I sighed as I came to the damage. It wasn't visible on the outside wall because the damaged armor panel had stopped when it impacted the exterior of the bulkhead. The lines would have to be repaired, but that was for later. I didn't have time to remove the damaged section and splice in a new one, so I did a quick and dirty fix. I shimmied underneath the panel and sliced off a foot of each broken cable with a mana knife. This needed to be done to remove the corrupted runic section. Since the runes just repeated continuously, this was rather easy. I then slid on a connector with a power ribbon attached to one end. I unrolled the power ribbon until it could reach the other side and lopped off another damaged section. I cut the end of the ribbon, leaving it longer than it needed to be, and clamped it into another connector. As soon as I slid the connector in place, the entire line flashed with mana as it began working again. I wrenched my arm around and pulled out my radio. Okay, cloak should be working again. There was an affirmative response from the radio as I tucked it away. I sighed, only 3 more lines to do on this side. It took me the better part of an hour to reattach the 4 conduits. Not because it was all that hard, but because it was a pain to move within the tight space. I also had to make sure the conduits couldn't touch each other or there would be bleed over. The radio crackled to life as the last connection was made. "Captain, the view screen is working again, but the enemy is still chasing us. We are gaining ground, but I don't think we can lose them like this." I was afraid this would be the case. Ever since I learned there was a way to track mana fluctuations, it was only a matter of time until some pirate crew had a capable person aboard. It's probably how they spotted us in the first place while we were invisible. I extricated myself from the crawl space before responding. "Keep going, try to find us an island to duck behind in the next few hours. I think I have an idea how to lose them." "Roger, Captain," Kickle replied. I felt the ship turn slightly and I steadied myself on the wall. The main issues may have been fixed, but the retribution was no longer in fighting shape. The shield was still broken thanks to the same armor plate that punctured the outer hull. Luckily the cloak didn't rely on the same runes to operate. I made my way to the command room and nodded to the others. "Are we on a good heading? I can't have any sudden movements for at least an hour." We should be good, Captain, but I can slow us down a bit if you want more time." I thought over Kickle's suggestion and nodded. "Do it, but not too slow. I have a feeling our opponents may not be showing their entire hand yet." I had seen the fast attack ships that pirates like to use, and hadn't seen a single one from the enemy fleet yet. Kickle gave me the okay and I unlocked the power distribution cabinet with my hand. The runic lock flashed white and the panel popped open to reveal the mana heart. I heard a couple of gasps and turned to see Emma and Barkos staring at the crystal. By the gods, no wonder this ship has so much power. I don't think I have seen a crystal that large on anything short of a dreadnought. I thought Barkos was being overly dramatic at first, but going by Emma's expression, maybe not. "Really? Hey," I turned back toward the cabinet with a smile as I enjoyed the stunned silence. I slid the power tray out and examined it for damage. It appeared to be fully intact. I had to open the cabinet to access the power control function for the whole ship because I couldn't implement this change on the consoles. I could turn off the passive mana gathering from any console, but I needed to shunt a massive amount of mana from the crystal to the exterior of the ship. So instead of creating a void in the mana as we passed, there would be an excess of mana. A smokescreen if you will. At the same time, I would need to disable the mana gathering array and we could hide anywhere on the island until our pursuers went away. At least that was the idea. I first needed to see if my idea would work. It was similar to the null beam in concept but not in execution. Although making the ship one giant omnidirectional null beam was appealing, it wasn't practical simply due to the fact that the energy would tear the ship apart since it wasn't made from mithril. I finished the programming and input it into the main power console. Carefully I slid it back into its housing and sealed the armored panel closed. The lock flashed again and the runes quickly vanished, leaving it looking like a simple bulkhead. It had taken me less time than I thought, which was good because it gave me time to strap in moments before Kickle raised an alarm and shoved the ship forward at full velocity. Enemy has launched intercept craft, they know we are going to try something as we get to the island. Concentrate on flying. Barcos, Emma, split the remaining turrets between you two and keep them off of us. I have to concentrate on this next part, we only have one shot at this. The fast attack craft only had one cannon but they also had grappling hooks. If they managed to get attached before I carried out my plan, we would be fucked. The Retribution tilted violently as a cannonball streaked by just below. This was followed by two more. I felt the ship rumble as the turrets fired out of sync. The enemy craft broke off and circled back around for another attack. We were nearing the island but I waited. The enemy ships got closer but still, I waited. It wasn't until the enemy ships fired again and the cannonball sailed past us that I activated the new command. Everything inside the ship went dead as the entire core dumped its stored mana around the ship. We started falling through a haze of expanding mana and I turned off the passive recharge. After what felt like an eternity but was only a few seconds, I turned off the command to dump all of the stored mana and started feeding my personal mana into the core. I disabled all systems except the cloak. Find us a place to hide, I ordered as all of my concentration was on keeping the ship flying by feeding it mana. I complained about Kickle's reckless flying but I had to admit it was effective. We found a spot to hide while the enemy ships bombarded the island searching for us. They knew we had to be there as escape would be impossible without leaving a trail. Well, they were right, sorta. Kickle came up with a daring plan, although I had to veto part of it. After the enemy ships had circled around the island long enough to muddy any trail, we simply slipped in behind their ships. Kickle wanted us to follow them away but I thought that was too dangerous an option so I proposed we just backtrack along our old path. We could have hidden in one of the other ship's old wakes but there was a much narrower margin of error there. So after 4 hours of playing hide and seek, we split off and followed the original trail back. Not as easy as you would think. Since Emma's skill didn't work from inside the ship and Emma couldn't go above deck or it would expose our position, we had to come up with an alternative. That alternative involved me torching a fucking hole in the front of the ship so she could peer through it from inside. I was going to add a periscope to my next design, this was ridiculous. Despite the crude method, it worked and we sailed away from the island without pursuit. Once we were well out of range we cut in a new direction and blasted toward the pirate island we freed, to effect repairs. 3 days of travel didn't seem like much in the grand scheme of things but for a heavily damaged ship it was. Especially when I had to continuously supply it with mana. I got Emma and Barcos to pitch in but neither had mage-based classes so their mana was very limited. To say I was tired was an understatement as we limped into port in the dead of night and with the mists as thick as I had ever seen them. After sleeping an entire day to recuperate, I inspected the damage for the first time. The others had snuck off at some point and were probably enjoying a beer down at the bar. But that was fine, I had a few former slaves here to help. I was going to need it. The damage to one side wasn't all that bad except for one section where 4 armor panels butted together. Apparently, that was where a cannonball struck resulting in the panels folding in and piercing the hull to slice through the power conduit. So it was a design flaw on my part. I should have had 2 layers of armor offset to prevent this issue. A note I added for future designs. Already workers were pulling out the ruined sections. They were quick to pick up on the benefit of a plasma torch. If that were the only damage I wouldn't be so grumpy. The main damage was to the underside. Entire armor plates were mangled. Some sported scoring from explosions but the main damage was caused by our impact on the other enemy ship. I watched as a dozen men pulled on a chain attached to one of those panels. The metal groaned as it bent out and the damaged turret finally released from its deformed socket, held in only by friction. I was glad it had held, if it had come loose during our escape, all of our efforts would have been rendered useless in an instant when the cloak failed. There was no way I was capable of doing the repairs myself in any reasonable amount of time. It was faster to direct these dock workers to do it for me. Money was less precious to me than time right now. With everything in the area spiraling out of control, I wanted to be back up and running as quickly as possible. On that note, I inspected the remaining weapons. While they didn't see prolonged use, I could already pick out the telltale signs of wear and tear on some of them. The overall winner in terms of resilience was the ones made from the strange bone powder. I guess I shouldn't be overly surprised by that. At least I had an easy means of making replacement weapons now. While the workers were removing broken components, I set about pressing and forming new guns. I was just going to replace all of them at once. This way I knew everything would be good to go. It also gave me time to inspect the runes connecting the turrets. With so much damage, some of those might have become damaged as well. Better to find out now than in the midst of another fight. I also debated on adding a second layer of armor to the ship now, but decided our speed was more important than armor. Plus we had the shield. Well, once I fixed the runes we would have a shield again. Chapter 217, The Enforcer. Sarvis limped past a line of bloody and broken men as they kneeled on the deck. He didn't follow the policy not to show weakness to subordinates. For him, it was more important to show that he would push through the pain. He growled deeply as he walked, making those closest to him flinch, but otherwise remain kneeling. Good, if they had moved he would have cut them down, for he needed no cowards on his ships. This little display was as much a test as it was a recruitment. The people before him were a mix of the captured crews and the survivors of his main ship. Already he had killed his second-in-command for incompetence, his cold dead body now more useful feeding the denizens of the ocean than being a pirate. His flagship was a mess. Half of the enchantments no longer functioned. The ones that did were having issues keeping them aloft and moving forward. He would sooner give his own life than abandon one of his fleet of ships, so he limped it along and they joined in the bombardment of the empty island his quarry hid on. He had not truly believed the reports from their spies, hidden amongst the crews in the failed attempt to capture that strange ship. That failed debacle was led by that incompetent Captain Tukath. But the information was still valuable and Sarvis had prepared countermeasures to protect his ships. This is why his ship still remained flying instead of on the ocean floor. The slave mages hidden below deck were used as nothing more than mana batteries to power the enchantments. At least the blast of destructive mana hadn't taken out the main enchantment array. If that had fallen, it wouldn't have made any difference how many mages he had aboard. When his crew first spotted the strange trail and cloaked ship, it didn't take him long to decide on a course of action. The boss wanted that new weapon. Unfortunately, the enemy proved more resilient than he had anticipated. It galled him to lose to some unknown captain. And the man still eluded him, so all Sarvis could do was vent his rage on this island in hopes of flushing his prey out. He didn't put much stock on it working, but it helped vent his crew's anger. For 8 hours his fleet reduced the island to bare stone, not a single tree or spot large enough to fit a ship remained, but their quarry hadn't been uncovered. Somehow, they had slipped away. It was as he expected, his quarry was wily. It was a failure on his part, one that made some of his crew eye him with disdain. He couldn't let the slight stand, so he sent his scout ships out to search for any anomalies. No ship could disappear without a trace. They would find them, and when they did, there would be a reckoning. But for now, Sarvis had to judge whether or not to keep these former slaves as crew. When he looked at them, he saw anger. It was bottled, but he could still see it in their eyes. When he came to the end of the line, he turned and faced the leader of these slaves. A man by the name of Lycan. This man didn't hold anger in his eyes, only cold calculation. And going by the fact that he slew his former captain for angering the pirate kings, he was probably smarter than most of the survivors. Why should I let you live? Lycan didn't flinch at the question, he only raised his head and met Sarvis's eyes. If you meant to kill me, you would have done it already. I figure you want my help. Sarvis roared in laughter, making some of the kneeling people jump in fright. His blade lashed out and 4 crescents of red energy tore those weak-willed men apart. Perhaps, he replied, watching Lycan's eyes for any fear as he was forced to watch his former crewmates die. The man didn't seem to care. Good. Then again, perhaps not. You know who I am, yes? Lycan turned his gaze back to Sarvis. Yes, you are the enforcer. Good. Do you know why I was sent out to this shithole? The man shook his head. I was sent out here to deal with you and your people. But my boss saw an opportunity as well. Where there is upheaval, there is a chance to benefit. You are from around this area. Again Lycan nodded. Sarvis didn't mention the strange ship and the new weapon. The man didn't need to know. Good. Sarvis snapped his fingers and 2 crew lifted Lycan to his feet. You will provide my cartographer with the locations of every pirate hideout and port around here. If I believe your information is valuable enough, I may take you on as crew. If not, well, your fate will be the same as them. Sarvis gestured to the fresh corpses. As for the rest of you. Sarvis waited until all eyes were on him. If I see anyone slacking off, you are going overboard. Now, get to work. Sarvis watched in glee as the former pirates scrambled to their feet and ran about like chickens with their heads cut off. The smart ones would figure out what to do quickly, the rest weren't worth keeping. Sarvis didn't have time to babysit his crew, the rest of the crew would police them for him. The hidden port wasn't much to look at, even more so now that the lone docked ship lay in tatters and the defences had been picked apart by Sarvis and his fleet. But it would suffice for his needs. He had already pressed the survivors, mostly slaves, into making repairs to his ship. He had to wait for a damn guild representative from the shipbuilders to arrive to fix the broken enchantments anyway. While this happened, Sarvis lounged in his cabin and examined the innocuous piece of leather that the former pirate slaves had turned over to him. He had killed the first former slave, thinking him a liar, but when the second and third corroborated the tale, he held off on killing them. It was only when he arrived at this festering shithole of a hideout that he was able to verify their claims. Of course, the slave he used to test it on was tossed into the ocean afterward. Sarvis knew slaves had their place. They were perfect for menial labor and as objects of release, either sexual or otherwise, but never on a ship. How could you trust someone with your life when they were forced to be there? He had overpowered larger fleets due to their sheer arrogance at thinking their massive numbers of slaves could somehow overwhelm his smaller but hardened crew of cutthroats. But this little slip of leather was a game changer. Offer a man his freedom and they would be almost as loyal as the crew he spent years with. You could never fully trust another pirate, but if you all had a similar goal, everything worked out. Chaz, Sarvis called, his bodyguard opening the door a moment later. What's up, boss? Like Sarvis, Chaz was another lianoid, although of a different clan. Get word to our spies, I want more of these items found. Also, see if they can figure out who is making them. Chaz caught the leather strap as Sarvis tossed it over. One last thing, let the big man know we secured the first objective but we ran into a slight snag that may delay the second. The failure would reduce his standing with the big boss, but Sarvis had learned long ago not to try and hide failures from that man. I'll send out the messages right away. The man closed the door and Sarvis heard him stomping down the hall toward the communication room. Jard sedately walked down the hall of the palace. He nodded politely to everyone he passed, even though his news was of critical importance to Prince Lamine, but decorum must be maintained. While Jard didn't see the point, he was at least skilled enough at pretending. Eventually, he reached the end of the hall and a large ornately carved door with a guard to either side. The guards eyed him and Jard tensed as the soldiers gripped their long spears tighter in case he might be trouble. Even though they knew him and he had been here only yesterday. He didn't know whether he should feel glad that they took their jobs so seriously or offended. Instead, he did neither as he cleared his throat and knocked lightly on the door. Enter, came the reply a few minutes later. Jard pushed the double doors open and closed them quietly behind him before turning to meet his prince with a deep bow. What is it today, Jard? I don't have much time. Apologies, my liege. This information pertains to your brother. Out with it then, what has that man gone and done now? Our spies are still gathering information, but evidence suggests Barcos may have been responsible for these slave uprisings. As much as I want my brother to be so foolish, what brings them to this conclusion? The ship your brother is currently crewing aboard was spotted at a number of the islands now seeing issues. One might be a coincidence, but he was spotted at 3 before the slaves started revolting in the streets. Also one was where that city guard was strung up. As you know, that entire city had to be put to the sword after they gathered up the remaining guards and hanged them for all to see. Prince Lamine sat back in his chair with a thoughtful look on his face. Yes, he could use this information to finally get those geriatric generals into motion and deal with this unrest. So far they had been unwilling to come down too hard on the citizens for fear of causing more unrest, but if a disgraced prince was behind the animosity, it could fracture the entire protectorate if left unchecked. Do we know where he is now? After some hand-wringing, Jard finally replied, No, my liege. We do have rumors that the ship he was on engaged with the Enforcer's fleet though. But they fled from the fight if the rumors are to be believed. Lamine frowned. More bad news, but if his brother's actions didn't get the generals moving, then the Pirate King's lackeys in the area would send invitations to the generals and the leaders from the other houses. I believe it is time for a war council. Jard bowed one more time before scurrying out of the room like a rat. Lamine couldn't stand the weasel of a man, but he was useful. After the door shut, Lamine activated the enchantments that prevented sound from escaping or anyone from scrying on him. Then he lifted the small box from a hidden cubby within his desk and set it down before lifting the lid. Inside was a small piece of mirror. Lamine didn't have to wait long for someone to appear on the other end. Prince Lamine, to what do I owe the pleasure of your communication? The pirate known as Blackgar said sweetly. The delicate waif of a man on the other side of the mirror could easily be overlooked as a pirate. His delicate half-elven features and expensive, yet tasteful, attire would have many mistake him as a prince himself. I hear your hunting dog had a run-in with my brother. Oh, that little fight, I almost forgot about it. The man smiled kindly, but Lamine could see the humor never reached his eyes. It seems your brother and his captain wounded my man's pride more than anything. You wouldn't happen to know where the craven rat is hiding so he could rectify this issue? If I knew where my brother was, I would go there and deal with him myself. Blackgar tittered at Lamine's proclamation, making him fume. Oh sweet prince! Let us leave the unsavory work to our lessers. Now, it is such a joy speaking with you, but is that the only reason you called your dear friend? Prince Lamine ground his teeth in frustration but kept his face neutral. No, I wanted to inform you, that we are mobilizing a war council. Oh, and what pray tell do you need a war council for? Certainly not a few unruly slaves. Not just a few slaves. Evidence points to my brother's involvement with freeing them. Prince Lamine might have been mistaken, but he thought he saw Blackgar raise one of his eyebrows slightly in curiosity. I wasn't aware your brother was an enchanter. My, what a talented man! Lamine bristled at the barbed comment. It also seemed like Blackgar already knew how the slaves were getting free. Lamine had only learned about it a week ago himself. His first thought was the guild trying to cause trouble, but the director assured him, no guild representative was responsible for the current troubles in the protectorate. An oath of truth confirmed he was not lying. But if not the guild, then who? It didn't take long to whittle down the possibilities to one ship. Nobody had seen the captain so much as approach any of the hot spots. An oversight, as Lamine's agents were more focused on keeping an eye on his troublesome brother. But if his brother had been at those ports, then so had the captain. A rogue enchanter would explain many things. The strange ship, the way he talked 3 experts into joining his crew, despite the risky endeavor to hunt down pirates. The fact that the ship seemed to disappear and reappear at random spots and there was always trouble afterward. If that was the case, then the guild must already be aware of the man as well. A man like that was too dangerous to let roam freely for long. Capturing him for Lamine's own ends would not end well. Lamine wasn't stupid enough to go against the guild, but killing the man would work just as well. Lamine closed the box, ending his conversation with the annoying pirate. The two weren't friends or even very friendly. It was an alliance born of mutual need and nothing else, one that he was beginning to regret making. Lamine looked at the time. He had 20 minutes before the council meeting, so he spent it going over what to bring up and what to hold back. Chapter 218, Island Retreat. Ship repairs were progressing adequately. I say that not to disparage the time and efforts the workers put in, just that I had never accounted for proper major repairs when I built the Retribution in the first place. It was a major mistake on my part and was making everything 10 times harder to complete. Take replacing the power conduits. Entire sections of the wall had to be removed to get at the areas in question. It was a good thing spatial storage was a thing, otherwise, even that step would have been impossible. I made a note to include smaller service panels for hard-to-reach places in future designs. Having to remove dozens of screws to get at one section was a nightmare. But that was the least of my issues. What I had mistaken for armor or surface damage, turned out to be structural. The entire keel of the ship had twisted slightly. Replacing it simply wasn't possible. So the workers did their best to straighten it out, but to do that they had to cut away the armor along the keel as well as 2 layers of welded titanium plates. I sighed as I watched the ship being sliced open. It felt like someone was butchering my favorite pet. Self-repair was high on the list of runes I was going to look into. I doubted I could get enough Hydra scale to cover an entire ship. Not that the Retribution showed up as a magical item anyway, so I doubted it would work as I envisioned. At least now I knew why the shipbuilders preferred wood over metal construction. Watching them work on the ship made me too melancholy, so I returned to casting my new monocannons and monolasers. Detail here mattered, so I took 2 full days carving the mold blank to exacting detail. I already had plenty of ground up bone powder for what I needed. I could have used my earlier mold, but I had rushed that one a bit. Better to start fresh for the best results. The first thing I did was pack the powder next to the raised runes. This would ensure there were no voids. I then lightly coated the entire wall. This step wasn't as important, but it still helped with the overall strength of the finished product. I then filled the cavity a bit and used a flat wooden mallet to pack the layers down. This was the longest part of the process. But I was still able to pack a mold in under a minute. It helped that the powder was weirdly tacky to itself and nothing else. Which meant I didn't need mold release. I warmed the entire mold over an open flame to set the exterior before popping it out of the mold and sanding the release lines off. Then in the kiln, it went. I already had a dozen barrels ready to heat treat and harden. I also had about 2 dozen failed attempts as I tried to master the process. I would break them down and reuse the good material later. At one point I figured out that having raised runes on the weapons worked just as well as making a negative mold, but was much quicker to build. It also made it easier to get the details. Unfortunately, I found out the raised runes were prone to chipping off either during the heat treating or as they cooled, making those efforts a complete waste of time. To try and save those attempts, I dipped the entire finished cannon in epoxy, then trimmed it away from the front and connection points. It made for an oddly jello-like appearance to the finished barrels. I hated it and I couldn't say why. So I scrapped those attempts as well along with my first mold and came up with a better way to make a mold. The runes needed to be embedded into the finished product, but instead of carving away everything except the runes, I simply welded metal to the inside where the runes would be and carved those areas until they were perfect. With the mold being split lengthways, it wasn't all that hard. I could have just done the same thing I did on my first prototypes and carved the runes by hand after forming the barrel. But I didn't want to carve 30 plus new weapons, not to mention the spares. Perhaps if I had a rune crafting class and it earned me experience, it would make sense to do it that way. But I was on the clock. I don't know if the others picked up on this, but if the Enforcer had captured the pirate ships, which seemed to be the case, then they had people that knew about this island. Maybe not our role in freeing it, but perhaps the fact that the freeing of slaves originated at this point. So it was only a matter of time until someone came by to check it out. Considering how we fared against one of those warships, I didn't like our odds against 3. Let alone the addition of the other ships with them. I wasn't going to be an ass and hide this fact from the people currently residing here. I was just going to wait until repairs were complete before I brought it up. It was a bit of a dick move, I knew that. But they only had themselves to blame for this current predicament. I didn't tell them to give a bunch of pirates the ability to free themselves and rampage across the islands until they drew the ire of the pirate kings. They did that on their own. At least they had a few ships and a steady shipment from the guild merchant. So they could leave if they needed to once I told them. Or they could hunker down. The island was certainly far more defensible than it had been. Each island bunker had portable shield emitters now, along with a full complement of cannonballs. It was surprising to learn that most of the island cannons only had 3 or 4 enchanted cannonballs prior to my arrival. The rest were simply iron cannonballs that weren't all that effective against a shielded vessel. I guess the cost was too prohibitive, or maybe they were afraid an errant strike could set off all the rounds at once. I didn't think that was possible, otherwise, pirates wouldn't risk the deadly payloads on their ships. I stepped into the noisy bar as the smells of alcohol and surprising appetizing food hit my nostrils. It didn't take me long to find the others. They were holding down a table and talking animatedly. Apparently, Barcos was miming his fight against the Enforcer, using a chicken drumstick as his weapon of choice. He was using Emma as the Enforcer's stand-in and she was stabbing at him with her bone swords. But Barcos expertly avoided her thrusts and would bop her on the face with the drumstick in reply while saying something I couldn't hear over the laughing and cheering of the other bar patrons. I couldn't help it, I chuckled at the absurdity of the display. Emma wasn't holding back either, but Barcos was treating the whole thing like some big joke. But she didn't seem to be too upset over it. I walked over and joined the table. "Captain," Barcos saluted with his half-eaten chicken drumstick, "what brings you by this fine establishment? I thought for sure you would be holed up with the ship until every last repair was complete. The workers are doing a fine job without me hovering over their shoulder. And my project is in the waiting phase, leaving me nothing to do. So I figured I would join my crew for some much-needed rest and relaxation." "So you were bored," Emma added before her arm reformed and she took a long drink of her beer. Pretty much. I don't like being idle, it seems wrong somehow. I knew why it felt wrong. Before the system, I would race through my work just to sit back and waste time on whatever caught my fancy. But after the system, I had no idle time because I needed to spend that time to stay alive. When that no longer became the case, I used my free time to protect my friends. I certainly didn't have any free time as a slave. Eventually, it was just ingrained into me to be doing something. Whether building a new runic device, weapon, armor, or leveling. When my friends overcame Lord Vict's attack, I was left treading water. With no apparent goal or drive, I wasn't sure what to do until Martin gave me the proverbial kick in the ass to get going again. Since that revelation, I haven't stopped doing something. This was essentially the first vacation I have taken since, and I was already hating it. I was fidgeting and nervous, waiting for the other shoe to drop or some big bad to come out of nowhere. For most people, it would be crazy to think like that, but I have pissed off so many people with my actions that it was more a foregone conclusion that eventually something would happen. Sometimes, you need to unwind and just enjoy the fact that you are alive, Captain, Kickle toasted. While I didn't completely agree, it would look bad if I left him hanging. I clinked my glass that the server had just dropped off against Kickle's and downed the rather thick beer. It wasn't a dark beer either, just unfiltered, leaving most of the sediment behind. Not the tastiest thing I had ever imbibed, but also not the worst. I realized I tended to get melancholic after a loss. Not much I could do about that, other than learn from my previous mistakes. It was sometimes easy to forget there were far more powerful factions and players in this world than I was capable of dealing with alone. So while I enjoyed the company of my crew, I thought over the issues ahead. My crew wasn't true friends as of yet, but if we continued to fight alongside each other we would eventually be. But that wasn't one of my issues. The first issue was the pirate kings and their fleets. It hadn't been nearly long enough since I tasked Emma to rile them up, so their presence had come as an unwelcome surprise when we accidentally came across the freed pirate ship we had been searching for. Had they not been there, I would have tailed the fleet and waited until they attacked another pirate base before I struck. But I was forced into action to at least take one of the pieces off the board in hopes I eliminated the original crew who knew of the island of origin. It was a risky gamble at best and probably wouldn't have worked out unless the other ships died in the fighting with the Enforcer's fleet. Unfortunately, the Enforcer wasn't a bloodthirsty idiot like so many other pirates. He must have seen a value at keeping the enemy ships and their crews at least partially intact. Otherwise, he would have simply destroyed them all outright. So what were they after? Information was the most likely reason I could come up with. And also my ship, or more likely my new weapon. It made more sense timeline-wise. I had first deployed it against two Catha's fleet of ships to fantastic results. It wasn't hard to imagine the pirate kings had a spy or multiple spies aboard those ships. You don't get to keep your position at the top for long without knowing what those below you are up to. That was two reasons to send ships here. But to what end? They already tried to capture my ship once, otherwise, they would have just blown us out of the air after our shield was down. They had to know a second attempt would not go their way. But I wasn't suicidal enough to stick around and test that theory. So they had other plans for this area, expanding their influence, I realized. And I gave them the perfect cover. With the Protectorate busy quelling the unrest and the slave revolt, the pirate king, Blackgar, had jumped at the opportunity to expand. But to be so well informed, he must have someone on the inside feeding him information. Someone who knew what was happening on every island and could see what was occurring before even the spies knew. Not a comforting thought. I finished off my drink and the food on my plate before nodding to my crew and heading back to the ship to think some more. I really needed to get out of this area before it turned into a complete war zone. My need to eliminate that prick, Captain Grulain, for his unprovoked attack against me and my promise to help Kickle was the only things that kept me here. I also wanted to eliminate the Enforcer and his fleet, but that wasn't a possibility with my current resources. Leaving and coming back wasn't an option either because I would have to start from scratch after the inevitable war that changed the entire political landscape of the Isles. Joining the guild was looking better and better. At least then I wouldn't have to worry about all the political bullshit that was happening around me. But I still didn't believe the offer was to my advantage. Director Tolish wouldn't have made it unless he had more to gain from it than I did. All this politicking and political crap gave me a headache. I just wanted to explore the world and crush my enemies. Was that so much to ask for? Chapter 219, Protectorate. Admiral Levins surveyed the destruction with disconnected apathy. When his fleet of 5 had arrived, they found the city under siege from slaves and commoners alike. He had immediately ordered all ships to fire upon the town, not sparing a single thought of innocent casualties. He did have to court-martial one of his captains when they refused his order, but the orders were eventually carried out. The once prosperous port city was a burned-out husk. And he held a scarf over his face so as not to inhale the stench and insanity that had permeated the entire town. His guards shoved corpses out of the way as he moved down the main avenue. Despite all the destruction, some rebels and their sympathizers had survived. He was here to pass judgment on them so he could move on to the next location. He had also heard rumors of one of the Pirate King's forces moving through the area and hoped for a confrontation. Although that seemed slim with Prince Lamine ordering him around the area like a trained dog. Searching for the prince's bastard of a brother was beneath an admiral. Even if the reports he had read were true. It was one ship and at most a dozen crew. Hardly a worthy target to send 5 Legion assets after, even if they were responsible for this slave uprising. Then again, being the commander responsible for taking down the Blade Master might just be enough to earn him a cushy retirement. Finally, his guards pushed aside the last corpse and Levin stepped into the central square. A group of ragged individuals was tied and kneeling. Levin scoffed at their filthy appearance. They were covered in blood, dust, and ash. He knew the outer islands were less civilized, but this was just absurd. A man had to have pride in his appearance in all things. Especially in war. The admiral snapped his fingers and his aide ran up and held open a scroll for him. Levins didn't need the scroll, but he liked how it made him look regal. I, Captain Thaddeus Levins, am here to pronounce charges on those gathered. The charges are as follows. Insurrection, murder, aiding and abetting runaway slaves, theft of property of said slaves. He kept reading off the offences, not that it mattered. The first offence was a death sentence. How do you plead? He had to ask for decorum's sake. Fuck you, you pompous sack of shit, one of the gathered people yelled. Well, I never. Levins bristled, is simple decorum too much to ask for? I guess I shouldn't expect more from a bunch of savages. There was a clamor from the other subdued captives, but Levins ignored it as he slashed his hand downward. Admiral Levins turned and left before the first of the guard put a knife to the prisoner's throat. It wasn't that blood bothered him, he just preferred not to have his lunch ruined by the scene. Prince Lamine paced slowly as he examined the territorial map that showed all of the Protectorate ships. Anyone with an ounce of tactical sense would see the glaring hole in the coverage that led straight to the capital island. He did his best to hide the movements of his followers, but it would be noticed sooner or later. But he had to keep the path open long enough for that bastard Blackguard to get his fleet through so they could assault the capital and kill the other family heads as per their agreement. This would leave Lamine as the sole surviving member of the Protectorate Council. Not that he trusted Blackguard at all. He knew if the notorious captain was given the opportunity, he would end Lamine's life as well. This is why Lamine took great care to hide his current location. The attack should begin any time now, he thought, as he looked at the clock. A bit of dust rained down from the bunker ceiling and Lamine smiled. Finally, his goals would be realized. Jard. Yes, my liege, the man said, rushing into the room. Bring me the communications orbs for the fleet. At once, my liege, the man replied quickly before bowing and scurrying off to retrieve the items. The entire island shook as dozens of cannonballs struck the city and shield. Prince Lamine didn't have the ability to disable the shield, but that was no matter. Over the years he had gutted their funding, leaving the resources to power the shield which hadn't been needed in over 100 years lacking. At best it would hold up for a few hours. And with the fleets away, there were few ships and even fewer island defenses to deal with a concentrated pirate attack. Jard rushed back into the room a few minutes later, nearly out of breath but carrying 2 large boxes containing expensive remote communication crystals. With a grunt of effort, Jard set them on the table that held the map. Prince Lamine waved the man into the corner. Wait over there and be quiet, I need to contact some of the admirals. Without waiting for a response, Lamine opened the first box and the melon-sized opal orb began to glow. The enchantments took a bit to activate, so Lamine took one last look at the map. He needed any possible spies of Blackguards to be misled by his fleet assets' movements before it was too late to pull away from the capital. There was a popping fuzz sound as the orb finished powering up and a transparent rectangular screen was projected above it. Admiral Levins, have you finished your current directives? The pinch-faced dandy of a man tsked quietly before replying. My mission has been a success, my liege. Lamine heard the disdain in the puffed-up man's voice, but he ignored it for now. The man would do as ordered, or the amount of blackmail Lamine had on him would lead to a quick walk off his own ship's deck. I have new orders then. Redirect your forces north along Falrem Island and then head east. Sir, if I may be so bold. I haven't heard of any disturbances in that area yet. Have there been new reports I am not privy to? Lamine ground his teeth at the man's gall. Of course, the man knew there were no new reports. If the Admiral wasn't such a spineless twat, Lamine would take the comment personally. Reports suggest that my brother and that ship may be around that area. I don't have to remind you, Admiral, that it isn't your place to question orders, but to follow them. By your word, I will set sail at once. The Admiral cut the connection on his end, as rude a gesture as he could make in the circumstances. Lamine would deal with him after. Or maybe if he got lucky, the vaunted Admiral would die in the engagement. One could only hope. The second orb connected to another task force of ships. This one, more secretive and with a different mission. Captain Adav, tell me we have good news. My lord, the man bowed. We have located the ship but are unable to get close enough to determine if your brother is there. While Lamine should reprimand the man for using the wrong title, it secretly made him giddy, for soon it would be his title as sole lord of the Isles of Mist. He would deal with the remaining pirate kings and the upstart federation in due time. It doesn't matter, give me the location and I will send a task force to deal with him. Just make sure he doesn't leave. By your orders, the stoic man clasped his hand across his chest before signing off. Lamine smiled, everything was coming to fruition. His brother would be dealt with, that annoying elf that touted himself a pirate king would die and Prince Lamine would become Lord Lamine of the greatest kingdom on this new planet. So lost in his glee, Lamine failed to notice Jard had moved from his corner where Lamine could keep an eye on him. It wasn't until he felt the searing pain erupt in his back that he realized this mistake. Lamine tried to scream or yell out to his guards but he found his voice didn't work. He fumbled a health injector out of his storage ring and through shaky fingers managed to jam it into his chest as he stumbled away from his attacker but it did nothing for the blade still lodged in his kidney. Lamine stumbled again as he felt another blade slide into his back. He finally had the sense to turn and see his attacker. Jard stood there with a smile on his face and another dagger in his hand. I had a bet with Bossman that you would flee the island before the battle but the boss said you were too vain for that. Now I owe Bosgar a stack of credits. The man's smile turned cruel. I may be out the credits, but I plan on getting the most out of your hide before I let you die. Jard waved negligently with his dagger, run along now, it's no fun if I can't give chase. Lamine knocked over the map table in his panic, sending the expensive orbs crashing to the floor and shattering. Jard's cruel laughter chased him down the hall as Lamine stumbled past the corpses of his guards. A knife skipped off the wall next to Lamine, slicing into his cheek and causing him to flinch back. He saw a grinning Jard standing in the doorway hefting his other knife to throw. Lamine ran. Blackgar had spent the better part of a century setting this plan into motion. The so-called pirate kings were nothing more than his underlings. Had been since long before they came to the Isles. What better way to fool their opposition than to make it look like they were fighting amongst themselves? This way they weren't perceived as a threat until it was too late to do anything about them. The fighting also made sure all of his crews stayed fresh. So when he finally convinced that idiot prince to make his move thanks to a fortunate series of revolts and uprisings, Gar wasted no time. When it came time to assault the capital island, Blackgar didn't assault the capital with just his fleet. He gathered the entire combined armada of the Pirate King, which was him. The sight of his entire fleet gathered after so long brought a smile to Gar's face. Well, most of his fleet, Sarvis had his own orders and now they had a location. All of this was possible thanks to the royal buffoon with eyes of becoming a lord. As if a lord was mightier than a king. Gar smiled as he sipped his absurdly expensive wine from his plush chair on the command deck. He watched the city shields buckle under his fleet's continued assault. He would strip this kingdom for all it was worth, then move on. This new world was a treasure trove of possibilities and he would not miss out. Chapter 220, Turncoat. Captain Grulain hissed in annoyance as his second-in-command handed him his orders. His second flinched back and hurried out of the room. If he hadn't, Grulain may have cut him down in a fit of pique. It galled Grulain to be under the thumb of another. He had gotten rid of his father for that very same reason. And now thanks to a series of unfortunate events, he found himself beholden to the damn Pirate King Blackgar's lapdog. How was he to know the repair yard where he went was controlled by that snake? If he had, he certainly wouldn't have agreed to the loan to effect repairs to his cannons and ship. Repairs that had taken far longer than necessary, and left Grouillane on the sidelines as the entire protectorate seemed to be crumbling around him. An opportunity-rich environment he wasn't able to take advantage of. But that wasn't the most galling part. He found that his repairs were delayed on purpose so Gar could tighten his stranglehold on the local pirates. By the time Grouillane realized this, it was too late to leave. 5 of the Pirate King's top captains had shown up. Any captains or crew that refused to bend the knee, were simply killed. Without access to their ships, they had little way to stand up and fight. He ripped open the sealed envelope and tossed it aside, reading the contents inside. He was being ordered to reinforce the Enforcer's fleet for some mission. What that mission was, he wasn't notified about. He was only given the location of an island base and told to be there within a certain time. What wasn't said was that if he failed to show up, he might as well pack his bags, tuck his tail between his legs, and flee because no place within the Isles would be safe for him. Grouillane crumpled the piece of paper and hurled it against the wall of his ship's cabin. The repairs that were held up for so long were magically completed after he agreed to serve. With no other option but to follow these orders, he stormed out of his cabin and started barking orders to his crew. He would do as demanded until he saw an opening. Then he would strike. Admiral Markoth realized something was off long before he lost contact with the capital. He managed to gather together 3 task forces worth of ships before making his way to the island. He could already see smoke rising in the distance and he urged his captains to hurry. His scout ships were reporting a large pirate armada laying waste to the island. Preliminary numbers said the pirates outnumbered his fleet by 3 to 1. But Markoth was a patriot and he would try to save the capital even at the expense of his life. He ordered his ships to group into 3 and focus on one target. His only hope for success was reducing the pirate fleet's numbers enough to chase them off. The fight kicked off as scouts from both sides engaged one another. Unlike the spread-out pirate ships, Markoth's fleet was in tight formation. They carved into the weaker ships on the back line of the pirate advance without slowing. The fact that no enemy fighters attempted to board any of the admiral's ships, boded ill for the citizens below. Enemy ship after enemy ship dropped from the sky. Then one of Markoth's ships took too many hits and went down. The battle had already overflown the island, so when the ship hit, it caused a massive amount of damage. The admiral winced internally but kept pushing his fleet ahead. The surprise had faded and the enemy was beginning to come together. The battle raged back and forth as more and more ships were lost. Markoth's fleet was dealing significant losses to the pirates, but with each ship he lost, he was pressured more and more. He cursed the guild ships he saw waiting in the distance. They could easily help turn the tide of this battle, but they floated there, silent and uncaring for who the victor was in this battle. Then Markoth saw the capital ship of the enemy fleet. It was easily twice the size of any other ship. With 5 decks of guns and the telltale blue halo of an enormously powerful shield around it. Markoth knew this ship and cursed. For he had already spotted 2 other ships belonging to the Pirate Kings. Somehow the Pirate Kings had come together and Admiral Markoth shuddered at the realization. Making the hardest decision of his life, Markoth ordered his fleet to retreat. More ships would have to be gathered to deal with this menace. Unfortunately, the pirate fleet wasn't so accommodating to his wishes. His remaining ships were forced to battle a fighting retreat, losing another 8 ships in the exchange while only taking out an even dozen of the enemy ships. By now Admiral Markoth knew something was going on. He had spotted all of the capital ships of the Pirate King's fleets. And not a single order had come from the city. He could only think of one reason for this, and that was 1 or more traitors within their ranks. It meant the Protectorate leadership was likely dead. Markoth directed his remaining ships to the Legion stronghold of Parsa. He sent the few remaining scout ships that survived the conflict to alert the other captains and admirals of what had transpired here. He would likely be labeled a traitor by his fellow admirals, but he was fine with that. He wouldn't needlessly throw his men's lives away in the suicidal pursuit of revenge. Garinian, or as most people knew him, Black Gar, walked amongst the rubble of a stately villa. After the disappointing retreat of the Protectorate forces, it hadn't taken his men long to secure the entire city for their own. There were a few holdouts but nothing in this once grand residence. The inside of the residence showed very little in the way of damage. Some of the priceless art was splattered with blood, but Gar didn't mind. He found it heightened the pieces. Perhaps he would hang them in his stateroom. He stepped through the ornately decorated double doors that were now broken and hanging to the side. The room was the typical royal meeting hall. With a long hall, carpeted in rich fabric. There were torn and tattered banners hanging from the second-floor balcony, and the room showed the most signs of fighting out of any within the villa. At the end of the room sat an ornate throne made from some magical wood. The throne was elevated by one step above everyone who came to greet the former master. When Gar looked at the throne, he smiled widely. "Prince Lamine, so good of you to wait for my arrival," Gar said with a mocking bow. The prince tried to respond but blood trickled from his mouth and down his chin. There, prince, let me help you," Jard said as he came from behind the chair and gently wiped the blood from the prince's lip while injecting him with a health potion. The prince jerked, trying to get away, but his arms, legs, and even torso were pinned to the throne by a multitude of daggers and long jagged blades. "Let me go," the prince wheezed out. "Now why would I want to do that?" Gar asked. "You're my guest. Or am I yours? I guess it doesn't matter. You do know, it isn't nice to scheme against your guest, people might think you untrustworthy." The prince tried to shake his head in denial, but Gar just tsked him. "There is no point denying it. I have had agents among your staff and loyal people for decades. Even now, half of your ships are being overrun by crews loyal to me. The other half will then be crushed by their former friends. And you, my fine prince," Gar slapped him lightly on the cheek a few times, "will get to watch as your hopes and dreams are all crushed beneath my cunning plans." Gar watched as tears began to drip from the prince's eyes. He reached up and plucked a tear away. "Why?" the prince managed to force out of his raw throat. "Why? Why not? I have the power, why wouldn't I take everything you have? Did you assume I was some spurned local back for revenge? PSH, as if I cared one iota about this place," Gar said, gesturing around the room with one arm, while he gripped the prince's shoulder with the other. His grip elicited a wince of pain as the man struggled against the blades holding him in place. "No, I will do as I have done for hundreds of years. Take what belongs to me and burn everything else before I move on to something bigger and better. You aren't anything new or special, Prince Lamine. There are always people who reach beyond their means. The gullible many, and I have made an art form out of bending fools like you to my whim. So don't cry over your failure now. Be glad that you get to join the ranks of my defeated foes." Gar added with a devilish smile as he grabbed the prince by the hair and ripped him off the throne, causing him to scream in agony. "Come, little lord, witness the end of your country." Somewhere in a nondescript stretch of sky, two dark blue octopods flashed into being. Zif easily kept them aloft with his Shinnik abilities as he waited for his partner's report. He heard an indistinct burble come from his companion moments before he got the telepathic message. "Here. Closer." Ulk raised a tentacle and pointed to a group of barely visible floating creatures in the distance. Zif didn't recognize their species, but they resembled familiar monsters from their home. Dangerous creatures that could stun and kill even him. "We must be cautious if we are getting near our prey. I will freeze time while you hurriedly extract the information from them. We must be gone before my spell ends or the side effects will be disastrous." Zif coached his partner. Already he could see their mana disturbance had attracted the creature's attention. He quickly spun his tentacles in a complex spell form that left burning crimson lines in the air behind his movements. A complex spell array was taking shape as he moved faster and faster, his mana usage drawing the floating creatures to them even faster. "You only have a minute, then I will teleport us away." He could feel the burbling annoyance coming from Ulk, but he ignored it as his last tentacle snapped, the spell form closed and everything besides the two of them froze. "Go." Zif watched Ulk zip toward the creatures as he monitored his quickly emptying mana pool. His mana regeneration rate was prodigious, but this spell was one of the highest level spells he had ever acquired, being tier 3. If Ulk's power didn't require direct contact to determine fate lines, it wouldn't be necessary for Zif to utilize this spell at all. Already he could feel the spell slipping and some of the creatures had started shaking violently as they bumped into each other even before his spell took hold. As Ulk worked, Zif scanned the creatures. They were named Gossamers and his spell let him know that they contained highly explosive mana gas mixtures. It was no wonder they had been attracted to his magic, and he was glad his danger sense had alerted him. After testing 5 of the creatures, Ulk finally flailed his tentacles about in satisfaction. Link. Finally, after more than a month of blundering around blindly, they had found a new link to their quarry. "Come, my spell is becoming unstable." Ulk rushed back to his side as Zif split a hole in reality. Ulk rushed through and Zif entered right behind him. As the spatial tier closed, time restarted. If anyone were in the area to witness it, they would have seen an entire school of Gossamers detonate in a massive explosion.